This story began with the desire to compare Ken Botnick's artist books with John Fraser's collages, which used discarded books and historical artifacts. Rapport of Beauty is a phrase inspired from my reading Diderot's 1752 essay on the beautiful. We sense a rapport, a bond with an object, caused by its beauty. Beauty became regarded by philosophers as a special kind of existence, and who saw other qualities in beauty, giving them the names truth, goodness, and morality. Diderot noted that the ideas attached to beauty's definition must be explored through language. Literary scholar Elaine Scarry has done the most to develop the ideas and connotations that philosophers see connected to the beautiful. Scarry concludes that beautiful things give rise to a notion of distribution, to life-saving reciprocity, to fairness, all creating a symmetry of everyone's relations to each other. This is the moment beauty links with social values such as justice. Botnick and Fraser exemplify two very different approaches to the book as object of art. Diametrically opposed in content, using differing techniques of expression, the two artists establish a high level of aesthetic excellence. Both Botnick and Fraser's oeuvres inspire close readings from us of their complex sign systems. Both artists foster an appreciation for the beauty of art and an art harmonizing with social values. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our two artists of the exhibition, The Rapport of Beauty, John Fraser and Ken Botnick. John Fraser is a multimedia artist whose work has been shown worldwide since his first one-person exhibition in 1980. He embraces a full range collage and assemblage possibilities, and his work is found in numerous public and private collections around the world. Ken Botnick is a designer, printer, and publisher of limited edition artist books. In St. Louis, his books were published by his press known as M-. Botnick recently retired as professor of art at Washington University, St. Louis, where he was the inaugural director of the Kranzberg Book Studio. Gentlemen, I welcome you both to our interview. John, you often use discarded books in your collages and assemblages. What power, meaning, and value do these old books have?
To start, I would say that the book was probably something, when I say the book, I put it in quotes, the book and its parts became something that I found, like I do most of my found objects and found materials, as efficient. They do come with a laconic power of everyone that ever touched them. And I kept them in somewhat of an anonymous status in my work. There's no titles usually of the book in the work. It's usually the architecture of the book that I'm trying to respond to. The aged papers I'm particularly attached to. I go through a great deal of effort to select based on touch, hue, color, value, whether or not they'll survive my working process, which is using various different kinds of adhesives, cold mount as well as liquid. And sometimes the materials do not survive. And that is not something I can tolerate. So I've spent a great deal of time learning how to place emphasis on the work and the materials that survive the process. And most of these things are labor intensive. But I'm very much responding to the power of what's found. And that, of course, when you work with found objects, you're working with a personal selection of found material. And the book was something that I found readily available. It comes loaded with meaning in itself. I do not consider myself a book artist necessarily, but it is probably the primary component in my work.
Thank you, John. Ken, you've often said that you seek out authors to make an artist book that share an affinity with you on some level. How much freedom do you have using the artist book genre to express the author's content? Where do you push boundaries and where do you pull back?
Well, I thought about that question a little bit, and I think there's a bit of parsing that has to go on, because when I work with an author, somebody like Mary Jo Bang, I don't consider the work that I do with an author who has written a body of work, poems and so forth, as an artist book necessarily. I define the artist book as when I'm the author and I use a full range, a full menu of things at my command that are extensions of the authorship of that book. In other words, conceptualization, content development, design, materiality, and the manufacture of that thing. So I don't take the liberties or the range of outputs when I'm working with an author. And over time, my work has changed from beginning where I was the kind of invisible hand behind the book of hand-printed poetry. And over time, I haven't seen the challenge necessarily in repeating that act. And so I've become much more involved with the production of all of the content and working really as designer, as in the role of designer as author. I mean, I think that the interesting thing about being paired with John's work is that much of my work I see as collage and construction as well. And actually, Ruth Rogers, who's a curator at Wellesley, referred to me recently as a textcavator, meaning, I excavate texts and I'm finding new meaning from that. So, the Diderot project that's in the show is really a kind of a product of a collage-like process for me. So, I think it's important to keep the idea. Artist book is a thing that is laid on, like John doesn't think of himself as a book artist per se. And I think, it has become a kind of a blanket title for anyone who works with the book form. And, I think we have to be a little more defined with that term.
Ken, thank you. John, going almost in the opposite direction of what Ken just laid out, though you intend no overt content, your use of discarded objects carry a strong connotation of allegory or the retelling of one story through another. Do narratives play in your mind as you make them?
My goal, of course, is to ultimately produce an autonomous thing. Ken and I are both object makers, really. And so I'm very much engaged in a builder's logic, as Robert Mangold once said, to try to get to the point where a thing is produced that holds a great deal in sway. So I think at this point, over the last, I'd say 15, 20 years, a lot of my wall-bound reliefs, collages, they're in direct response to the built world. And as I've traveled, I've been very much absorbed by when I see cultures that out of necessity or ritual or just because it's how they think will rebuild or restore their structures, their built world. And when they overlay new material on top of old, repair, do whatever they can to even pay homage to the previous maker, that's what sort of drives how I build things. And after a while, my work became so governed by the built nature of the material. I use wood and paper for different reasons. Allegory, perhaps. I'd rather use the word metaphor, perhaps. And the found objects, I really have more to do with metamorphosis than anything else. But building something leads to the next thing I build. So it's like this continual flow of one thing after another. And it's all part of this program that I guess is about making a thing. But in terms of a narrative, the narrative is the work itself. I'd like to think that its source is in things that are seen. So I'm not commenting on the headlines or current events. My work is just talking about existence, really, and a shared existence in all its entropy.
Have you ever regarded your practice or aspects of it as allegorical, and why or why not?
I can't say that I have set out on a mission of creating, allegory or books that are filled with it. But when I saw that question, I realized I should take a look at some of my book pages. And again, like John, I think of in terms of visual metaphors of expressing content. What can I do to embody this idea more fully in both, image, text, mise en page, as they say, the kind of construction of the page. But I was thinking, okay, well, let me look at this in this book. And then there's a plate or a page late in the book that where I do a little bit of a meditation or an exploration on the idea of work and leisure. And there are these guys who are playing tennis. I don't know if you'll be able to see this really, but they're playing tennis. They're above. Okay. They're the pale ones. The dark ones in the foreground are the workers. So there's a real contrast in the body language between the workers and the leisure class. And of course, the leisure class is playing tennis up there with a diamond in the air. And then on this side of the page is, again, the leisure class shopping for clothing. And, there are some indications of the manual labor that have gone in to make that clothing. Plus, there's a seamstress in the background. And I included this little thing as an extension of the line that these guys were pulling, whereas this is a doodad that, would signify some very fancy calligraphy. So all told, there's a lot to be read on that page. And, it might be an allegorical setup. I never really set out to make it that way, but I think there's probably a certain amount of symbolism involved.
John, to what do you owe your sense of pleasing arrangements of these carefully chosen objects?
I think that as Ken would agree, I'm sure, that I think most artists work at an intuitive level in some way or form. I think there's a point where discipline might be the word I'd prefer to use. And I would tell you that my understanding of what I'm doing probably is greatly affected by my education, some of which I reject, some of which I accept. But I will tell you that, the golden mean, Fibonacci, all these things are in my past, but they are rooted in my present when I'm in the studio. I'm always looking for a certain correctness, a balance of some kind. And it's usually not something that I'm thinking about while I'm doing it. It usually comes as a result of the process. And then I have to, obviously look at it, study it, make the decision whether or not it survives. So I think it's a hard-won situation for me. But I'm always looking for that. If it's a struggle, I guess it could be a struggle, but I don't regard it as a struggle. But when you're trying to find something that will hold up and hopefully hold up over time, and you want to build it so that it can, and maybe be understood fully later, I'm not trying to postpone the current things, but I'd like to trust the fact that I am still interested in what I'm doing, and I'm being critical enough to look for that balance and that harmony.
Thank you. Ken, you write about pattern recognition in your Diderot project, which is a book that you have completely authored. You write, patterns are composed by objects and the fields they inhabit. The spaces in between objects are powerful shapers of perception. When we direct our attention to something usually overlooked, our perception of it changes. My question for you is, how does one consciously become aware of and then manipulate these in-between spaces?
I can answer this by partially saying I agree with what John just said. There's a lot of mystery about the way people create things. And I think that that's sometimes perpetuated by artists who want to seem mysterious, and sometimes, perpetuated by the culture who wants to make artists seem like crazy people who work on intuition and things just happen. But in fact, it is about discipline and about practice. It's just showing up in the studio every day and becoming familiar with your materials to the extent that you know when to follow their lead. And, that is referred to as intuition. I don't necessarily buy that. But, the second part of what I agree with John about is the product of education. I mean, I was educated in landscape architecture. That's my training in design. And, I had a wonderful teacher who explained to me that, you look at a plant in the landscape and you need to start seeing the space around it, how it shapes all of that space in and around it, between itself and other things, plants to plants, plants to architecture, architecture to architecture. All of those things have meaningful relationships. So the fact that you chose the idea of the rapport as the name, that you're working with that as a valuable concept, the rapport is the space in between things. It's that space that gets negotiated. It's like brain scientists used to study only neurons. Now they're studying the synapses. And the synapse was that overlooked space because things just jumped across there. But now they're seeing that the space between the things is really where a lot of information is happening. And you can tell a lot about, how a brain is functioning that way. So it's, it's again, it's no gift from God, about insights into seeing spaces between things. It's about having a really good, or maybe even a really bad teacher, as John says. It's like you get woken up to things, and sometimes you're awake enough to actually follow them and hear them when they're being told. Sometimes it takes 5, 10, 15 years to find them percolating up again.
I like that answer a lot, and particularly
Excellent.
the part about looking at the in-between spaces of synapses.
Yeah, I mean, the richness of finding continuity between two, sometimes, that's my whole practice is about that. And I think John's also probably in there as well, as finding those relationships between things that people don't think that are related. And, the whole thing is you go into your studio and you say, how does this and this work? And the thing that never gets really talked about and taught in design education, from what I can tell, is the concept of tension. We're a culture that's tension averse because it's become a kind of a pejorative, but meaningful art that has longevity is fueled by tension.
Has to have it.
I'm sorry?
It has to have it.
It has to have it. And you have to, you train your students to look for those moments where it lives. And, you say, where is the tension in this thing really produced? What are the elements that are rubbing up against each other that cause you to step back a minute and say, whoa, there's an energy there. And those are the things that are really exciting to me. That's what I look for in books. I look for it in all work. We think beauty is produced by pretty things, but it's actually, it's a whole lot more complicated than that.
Okay, this is our final question, and I would like to ask the same question to both of you. To my immense satisfaction, both your practices challenge the digital cannibalism that consumes all reading materials. The digital dispenses with the original signifying materials of the object. It gets rid of the very thing that begins interpretation. Both your practices resist speed reading and celebrate the physical material qualities of the object. How has the digital technologies helped or hindered your art making? And do you think of your art as combating or resisting the digital?
There's no resisting. It's there in the world, and you can't avoid it. I think the difference is that, I'm 66 years old. So the way that I engage digital technology comes from the groundwork of having done everything by hand for so long, that my relationship, I know what I'm after in use of digital technology is different from, let's say, my 22-year-old students. But my work today could not be accomplished without the digital. The Diderot project came out of use of the computer completely. And from the beginning of doing a digital photography survey of all of the plates in the original encyclopedia, but using the digital as a tool to organize, to extract from, to really constantly overlaying one thing over the other, almost sometimes by accident. So I couldn't do the work. I couldn't physically have done that because the way that just the blocks of text are formed would have taken me forever just to shape those things by hand. So, it's all made with plates that have come from using my computer as a type foundry and using the computer as a way of translating the images to plate, a form that I could get out of a printing plate, because I'm using a 500-year-old technology to realize these things. And that's actually one of those moments of tension that I'm really interested in, is what is the point of contact between the manufacture, the hand making, and the digital side of things, and where do those things rub up? In the making of these pages, for instance, I don't know if I told you this, but this book was made groupings of pages. Groupings of pages are called signatures. So one signature at a time. I was writing, editing, designing this signature while my assistant and me, producing the previous one. And I was just staying one. It's a completely goofy and not a recommended way to go about making a book, because there's a lot of loss and a lot of wrong moves, but it also allows you a kind of a tension of massive failure that is really necessary to keep things interesting and alive in one studio. It's like you get to a point, I know I can print a really good book. I'm not interested just in printing for printing's sake. I need something that is really challenging me, where I'm just like, on the wire without a net all the time. And that book did that. You have to be really willing to do something terrible. And I spent a year working on that project in a way that when I was going to see a curator friend in Chicago, he looked at the early pages and he just shook his head. I'm not afraid of showing things work in progress to, there are about 2 or 3 people in the country that I know I can show things to and get a straight answer. And he just looked at it and he shook his head and he said, "You can't do this." He said, "No, Diderot's been done to death. There's nothing new to be done with this, and just stop." And he was right about one thing, that the project was crap when he was looking at it. And I went back to my studio and I said, okay, well, I either throw out this year of thinking about and working on this project, or I prove him wrong. And I get back to work and find, a way to do that. I didn't know where it was going, but the risk, the challenge of proving him wrong was a great delight to me the whole time. I knew I was going to hand him a book at one point, and I was just waiting to see what the look on his face was.
I think you really showed that, curator. It's an amazing statement. John, how do you think of the digital technologies in relationship to your art making? And do you think of in any way of your artwork sort of being a statement against the digital?
I do not think it's a statement against the digital, but I am pro-analog. Even in my music listing, I'm pro-analog. And even in my photography, I'm pro-analog. But I have slipped into digital cameras too. So, and Leica is a Leica is a Leica. So it's all about the lens, Anyway, in terms of has it affected my work? I think I require it to manage what I do, in terms of managing your photographic material, managing record keeping, all those things are crucial. Communicating with people, very much important to my practice. But I will also tell you that while it is a tool and an essential tool, it is probably the least important tools. The tools that I value the most are a collection of Japanese saws that require understanding and attention and control. And so I'd rather work with hand tools. I do have a wood shop, but there's only one power tool out there that I use. Everything is done by hand. and I'd rather go back into it and work it with various, scrapers and sanding material to get it to the point where it meets my needs as a finished form. But in terms of, digital saws, which I know are out there now with lasers and everything, I may ultimately get one in terms of precision, but I happen to like how I feel when I'm working with a Japanese saw and breathing in relation to what I'm doing. So I would say that I'm not intimidated by it at all. I don't see myself ever using a computer monitor to create a work of art at this point. I know so much has happened and there's been a great deal of advance in the last 2 or 3 years, let alone the last 10. I just don't find the pull. I don't feel it. I like working with my hands as long as I have the ability. I want a viewer to connect with the hand, not the digital aspect of my work, I guess.
Excellent. John, thank you. Gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for sitting down with us today and sharing some of your thoughts. This interview has shown some really incredible similarities between the two of you, the way you work, particularly the way we were sort of wrapping up now, and you were talking about, the importance of making objects by hand. I knew there would be some wonderful contrast between you two artists, but the similarities really became just a little bit more profound for me today. Thank you so much for sitting.
As well.
Thank you so much for sitting down with us and sharing your thoughts and processes with our communities. Much appreciated.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Ken.